Okay, so for today, I'm going to do two principal things. The first is I'm going to give just a little bit of background to Kant, who he was, where he lived, when he lived, that kind of thing. And secondly, and mainly, I'm going to introduce you to Kant's moral theory. And if you recall, most recently, we looked at Hume's moral theory. That was the video lecture that I did for Monday. And just in point of contrast here, we know Hume says that morality is not really rational. It's really based upon passion or sympathy. And Kant is going to say the near sort of polar opposite. So there are Kant's dates right there. He's this German Enlightenment thinker. He came from a place called Königsberg in Prussia, although that is now Kaliningrad in Russia. And sadly, virtually none of that town exists in the same form that it did back in Kant's day because it was bombed so excessively during the Second World War. So presumably Kant would not recognize that town now. He was a lifelong bachelor, and he was also a university professor. I think that's important to keep in mind because so many of the people that we study in the history of philosophy were not university professors. They certainly were not community college professors. They did not, have tenure. Many of them did not have PhDs. I mean, look at Socrates, right? However, Kant, as well as Hegel and Schelling and many of these other people in the modern period did. This was especially true, for the Germans who, have always prided themselves more on having very rigid and very structured universities. Kant actually started out as a Leibnizian. There was a guy by the name of Christian Wolff, or Wolf, if you prefer, who was a sort of probably the most important person in the 1700s who was disseminating, an interpretation of Leibniz's philosophy to Germany and the European continent. And so when Kant started out, he was this basically Leibnizian university professor. But over a period of time, in particular after he read a little bit of David Hume, he realized, wait a second, a lot of the things that Leibniz talks about with metaphysical speculation and everything can't possibly be supported because it presupposes that we know things about induction and innate ideas and all these other kinds of things that Hume critiques. So a lot of what Kant is going to talk about is going to be a way of trying to find a response to David Hume, although most of what we'll talk about today will focus really on his moral theory. So he's going to talk about this moral law that he says is written on the hearts of all human beings. And in terms of his views of science, he really was a Newtonian. So we thought Newton's view of science was more or less correct. And he wrote many works, the three most important of which are his three critiques. So you've got the Critique of Pure Reason, and that's something we'll be looking at in with a certain degree of extensive analysis next week. And that really deals with his views of epistemology and metaphysics. The Critique of Practical Reason, which deals with moral matters. And he also wrote a work called The Metaphysics of Morals and also a work called The Groundwork, which deal with a similar kind of subject. And then lastly, you've got the Critique of Judgment. That's where he talks about things like aesthetic judgments about the world. And we're not really going to cover that at all, but these are collectively just known as his three critiques. These are not the only things that he wrote, but these are sort of the three kind of linchpins of his system. And Kant said in his first critique that there were basically three main philosophical questions that we have to ask. One is, what can I know? How should I act? And what can I hope for? So he thought that all philosophical speculation ultimately boiled down to those three concerns. If you think about it, what can I know really is a question for epistemology. How I should act is a question in ethics. And what can I hope for is sort of a question about, I guess you could say that's more like the philosophy of religion. It deals with issues about, do we have a soul? What happens when we die? Is it possible that progress in the world is real? I mean, in other words, what are the chances for having peace in the world, and a world in which you have good government, and a world in which the future has greater possibility than the past did, and so on. Notice these philosophical questions are quite different to what you see in other philosophers. For example, the French existentialist Albert Camus said there's only one fundamental philosophical question, which is whether or not to commit suicide. So Camus' question is quite different to that of Kant. So Kant is not the only person who thought of philosophy in terms of questions. His philosophy collectively is known as transcendental idealism. Now, I can't get into the specifics of what that is going to mean today, but he's going to promulgate some version of idealism, but it will be different to that of Leibniz or Spinoza, or not Spinoza, Berkeley. And what this ultimately is going to mean for us, this will make more sense after next week, is he's going to try to synthesize or find a middle ground that kind of combines the rationalist perspective and the empiricist perspective. So Kant's considered opinion is that the rationalists get some things right, but they get some things wrong. The empiricists get certain things right, but they get other things very wrong. And so there's got to be a way to sort of steer a middle path between these two great approaches. Now, as far as his ethical views are concerned, Kant is what is called a non-consequentialist. So to put this, and I'll come back to this point later on, but to put this in a very general kind of framework, Kant believed that consequentialists like the utilitarians were wrong to say that ethics was based upon effects. So for instance, the adage, the ends justify the means. Example, is telling a lie morally okay? Is it permissible? A consequentialist would say it would depend on what the consequences of that lie happen to be. If, for example, it produces more benefit than harm, maybe the lie is justified. Kant thought that that was actually completely incorrect. So he thought that ethics really is not based upon the consequences. It has to be based on something else. Now, that something else ultimately for Kant is what we might call our motive or our intention, or what Kant calls the goodwill. So Kant thinks really morality has less to do with the effects we produce in the world than it has to do with the kind of motivation of the moral agent who decides to make a choice. Another way to think about this is Kant was a proponent of what is called deontological ethics. So a deontological perspective is a duty-based perspective. The Greek word deon means duty. So Kant, as we'll see, talks about many types of duties which we're kind of, well, we're duty bound to obey or maybe to carry out. And Kant also gives us a way of testing what he calls our maxims, or our, let's call it our motivations, expressed as a kind of rule or principle. And this test, if you will, is what's called the categorical imperative. And this is an expression that, you know, if you've taken an ethics class before, or maybe an intro to philosophy class, you probably will, if you've heard anything about Kant before, you probably have heard this term. It's rarely the case in a class that's below this level of sophistication, because this is really more of an advanced kind of history class. It's quite rare for you to come across as an undergraduate, Kant's epistemology and his theory of judgment and so on. But lucky us, that's exactly what we're doing, because we're a little more advanced than that. Okay, so we have a quote here. Kant says, "Nothing can be conceived in the world, or even out of it, which can be called good, without qualification, except a good will." So you've got that expression, goodwill, right there. Intelligence, wit, judgment, and other talents of the mind, however they may be named, or courage, resolution, perseverance as qualities of temperament, are undoubtedly good and desirable in many respects, but these gifts of nature may also become extremely bad and mischievous if the will which is to make use of them, and which therefore constitutes what is called character, is not good. It's the same with gifts of fortune, power, riches, honor, even health, and general well-being and contentment with one's condition, which is called happiness. Inspire pride and often presumption, if there's not a goodwill to correct the influence of these on the mind. And with this also to rectify the whole principle of acting and adapt it to its end. So, first of all, are there thoughts on what this quote might mean?
Well, I think it makes sense. I think because, like, if you think about if someone were to do an action and his intentions are good, but it leads to or if his intentions are bad and the action itself does not end up getting the consequences that he expected, like as bad as he thought. So does that justify what he did? Because say not saying that I would do this, but say someone had a plan to shoot up a place and kill a lot of people, and he gets caught right before he finishes his action. I mean, the consequences didn't really happen,
right?
But he still went in with that intention.
Right. Yeah, that's actually a very good example. So there are any number of instances in which you could say a person may have intention X, where X is maybe actually quite evil or quite, bad. Or alternatively, it might be good, and yet we could make a distinction between what's going on the level of the agent and what actually is going on in terms of the effects of the action. So you could, your example illustrates sort of a bad intention that does not produce for the agent a certain desired effect. They're arrested or they're prevented from doing what they want to do, what they intend to do. You could also invert that. You could say there could be cases in which a person has a good intention and yet they're not able to actually carry it out. Or maybe the consequences are interesting. They're kind of like, it's like rolling dice, when you're playing like craps or something like that. You never really know exactly what's going to happen. And obviously the more consequences you have, the greater the number of variables and the greater the level of uncertainty. And so, Kant would say you can't really judge people by the consequences, by the fruit of the action. You really have to look at the underlying maxim or motivation of the action in itself. And the other thing to notice here, he says, nothing can be called good without qualification. So the only unconditional good would be the goodwill. So if we think of things that he mentions, for example, he says gifts of fortune. So think about money as an example. Money is neither good nor bad. It could be used for good purposes. It could be used for bad purposes. Honor, health, even something like intelligence or, a physical characteristic like dexterity, right? I mean, the same person who is able to save a person's life in a surgery could use those same techniques to kill somebody. I mean, all of the extant information about Jack the Ripper indicates that, if you look at the conditions of the bodies that Jack the Ripper is believed to have killed, I think it's only 5 people that they've confirmed. There's some speculation that maybe he had surgical training. So that, is surgical training actually good or bad? Well, it would really depend on its use. And to get to the use, you really need to get to the inner springs of the action which exist inside the agent. So the takeaway from this is something like the following. If we want to understand morality, we have to pay less attention to the consequences of an action, and we have to pay more attention to the intention behind the action. But hang on, this might lead to the following kind of problem. You might think, okay, as long as I meant well, the action must be a good action. But Kant, of course, is worried about that, right? He says we have to be sure that our intentions are actually moral intentions. And to do that, he comes up with a test. And the test is what he calls a categorical imperative. So categorical imperative is going to function a bit like a litmus test in chemistry, right? You use a litmus test to determine if something is a base or an acid. In this case, the categorical imperative is going to test our maxims, right? What we intend to do with our action. If we don't have a categorical imperative, then there would not be a way to determine whether our intentions are actually moral or not. Now, before we get into the specifics of this, notice the word categorical imperative. An imperative is a command. So Kant calls this a command of reason. Notice that's not a command of passion, as Hume would say, right? But it's a rational imperative that commands us to do something. And of course, commands oftentimes are things that we don't want to carry out, right? So there's a kind of schism for Kant between what morality commands us to do and what our inclinations most desire to do. So those are two very different things. The other word there, categorical, connotes something like universal. So it's something that categorically applies in all cases. Now, Kant says that there's only one categorical imperative, but then he goes on to say it can be expressed in a number of different ways. And there is some dispute in Kant scholarship about whether these different formulations, these different expressions, really logically mean the same thing. I'm not going to get into that now, but just to let you guys know, that is an issue that Kant scholars do wrestle with. If you look at his works, there are something like 3 or 4 different formulations of the categorical imperative. I'm really only going to focus on 2 of them, just for the sake of time. So the first one, which we might call maybe the universal formulation, says something like, act always on such a maxim that you can at the same time will to be a universal law. So we have we have the word maxim, and we have the word universal there. Now, what Kant is proposing here is something like this. Let's say that we take an example that Kant himself uses, which is called the lying promise. A lying promise is a promise that we make, and when we make the promise, we have no intention of keeping the promise. So in saying, for example, yes, I will pick you up at the airport on Friday at 6 a.m. If I intend to really make that promise and to carry it out, then I'm not making a lying promise. But if I'm thinking in the back of my mind, no, there's not a snowball's chance in hell I'm going to be getting up at that time. I'm not picking you up at the airport, but I'm just going to lie through my teeth. I will pick you up at the airport. That's a lying promise. So how does a lying promise work? Well, my maxim, and by maxim here, he means something like, if you had to explain to a rational agent what it is you're doing when you're making that promise, your justification or your explanation would be something like, well, I'm basically telling a lie. And when I'm lying, really what I'm doing is I'm telling the lie in order to produce some result that I don't think I could get if I didn't lie. And that could be the case for many things. For instance, You go into a bank and the bank officer, the loan officer says, do you promise to repay this mortgage? And you say, yes, obviously I do. But your reason for lying in that case is you know that you're not going to get the money unless you lie. If you said, hey, I just want you to give me the money, but I'm not going to make any mortgage payments. Once I have the money, I'm going to leave town and you'll never catch me. If you obviously were honest there, you could not get what you wanted. So telling a lie in the form of a lying promise really implicates you in this way. It means when you feel like obtaining something that you couldn't get unless you lied, that's when you lie. However, if you universalize that, that means that you're willing into existence a world in which everyone lies, okay? So if lying were universal, what do you guys think would happen?
Well, wouldn't the problem be is that, well, if everyone lies, then I guess there would never be anything true. So, like, how could you ever trust anyone if you know they're going to lie anyway?
Correct. Right. So if I told you, Everardo, I'm going to pick you up to the airport at 6 a.m. on Friday, and everybody lies, that means you would be a liar as well. And so you would be in on the joke or the secret, so to speak. So like I would never be able to lie successfully because nobody would ever trust anybody else. So the very conditions of telling a lie presuppose that people believe that you're being honest.
Yeah,
so
like
if it were universal, lying would never work.
Then if I would, if the line was universalized and I said, there's no way I'm gonna pick you up on Friday,
right.
And I'll pick you up.
Right, then exactly. Although, yeah, you're right. Right. So obviously you were lying. So, but yeah, it'd be like opposite world, wouldn't it? Right. Yeah. So language, the very meaning of our language would somehow shift. It would change. Right. So Kant says that universal lying is a logical impossibility. Now, notice a subtle but important distinction here. So if you were a utilitarian, you might say you shouldn't lie because lying would produce really bad consequences in the world. It would make people sad. It would make them trust people less. Society would break down. Kant can't use that justification for not lying because that would be consequentialist. Kant is not saying that you can't actually get away with telling a lie in a particular case. Obviously, he wasn't dumb. He knew people could lie. But the thing is, there's a logical impossibility that underlies universal lying, right? That there's an inconsistency here. Now, there's a similar thing that goes on with this problem, right? Take the case of stealing. So in the case of stealing, a person has a maxim, something like, when I feel like stealing in order to get something I couldn't otherwise get, I will steal. But if you universalize that, that means you're willing a world in which everyone would be a thief, in which everyone would steal. But in that case, that means that if everyone stole, no one could actually ever own anything, right? Property would not have any meaning at all. And I always add this whenever I discuss this with a class, whether people actually believe me when I say this, I'm never quite clear. But trust me, if you look this up, there are cases in which people do this. Every once in a while, there's a news report that the exact details will depend upon the exact situation, but the gist of it is something like this. You'll have somebody who does something like they'll steal something. They'll steal, say, a car. They take the car, they have it for a few weeks or whatever, then they wake up one day and their car is not there. And, if this were me, I'd think, okay, my stolen car has been stolen. Okay, no harm, no foul. I didn't really own it to begin with. But wouldn't you know, every once in a while, some of these people that are thieves phone the police and they say, hey, you got to get over here because somebody just stole my stolen car, which is just crazy if you think about it, right? So what these people are really doing is they don't want to abolish property rights. They just want to dispossess legitimate owners of their actual legitimate property and use it as their own property, right? So you can't do that without some kind of inconsistency. If you're a thief, really what you're doing is you're saying, I want to own things illegitimately that other people legitimately own. So there's, again, an inconsistency with this. So universal stealing is a logical impossibility. So Kant would say in these kinds of cases, this means that we should never lie and we should never steal, because anything that violates the categorical imperative would automatically be something that we are absolutely forbidden from committing. But again, notice, this is not really a consequentialist analysis. There is a way in which you can say, well, this is a logical consequence of the underlying maxim, but it's a consequence in terms of logic or inconsistency. It's not based upon real world, kind of real time actual consequences. So he's not saying stealing is bad because it will make people sad. That would be more of a utilitarian approach. Now, the second formulation I'll give you guys, which I think is actually easier to understand, is act as to treat humanity, whether in your own person or in that of any other, in every case as an end, never as a means only. So what Kant is suggesting here is, again, this is sort of a subtle but important point. Kant is distinguishing between a means and something that is only treated as a means. So if you go out, of course, it'd be difficult to do this now, unless you picked up, curbside dining or something like that. But like, let's imagine in a few months, restaurants maybe are fully open. You go out to a restaurant, you have a nice meal, and you leave the restaurant without paying your bill. And you do this deliberately. It's not like an accident, right? In that case, you really are using the people at the restaurant as a mere means to your end. If you had told the person when you arrived at the restaurant, by the way, I'm going to dine and ditch. You're going to serve me food and then I'm going to leave. I'm not going to pay. The person would not serve you food then, right? So, think about cases in which you do not respect the freedom or autonomy of the agent in question. Examples: enslaving a person violates that person's autonomy as a moral agent. The evil of slavery has nothing to do with the consequences of slavery. It has to do with the fact that the very nature of slavery dehumanizes the slave, treats the slave as an object. So we don't need to know the consequences of an action, right, in order to know whether or not it is actually violating the categorical imperative. If something violates the categorical imperative, it is something that must never be done. So there are other kinds of cases you could think of. For instance, the United States government sponsored a series of trials starting in the 1940s with people who had positive diagnoses for syphilis. So they took a bunch of people in the study, all of whom were African-American men. They all had a positive diagnosis for syphilis. They, even after penicillin became a standard protocol for treating, in fact, it still is, the kind of first line protocol for treating syphilis. Even after that, they did not treat these men at all. They just followed the progression of the disease to see how it affected people of African-American descent. And I don't probably have to tell you whether or not the data that they got from that study was useful scientifically or not, in order to judge whether or not that was actually an evil thing to do, because obviously they violated the autonomy of those people. If you went up to any patient and you said, hey, you've got two options. You've got a horrible disease, we can treat it. Or option B, we don't have to treat it, and you'll come in here every once in a while, and as it starts to shut down your organs, we'll just take notes. which one of these do you want to do? Do you want to be a guinea pig, or do you want to be properly treated? And no rational agent would accept that second option. So the very nature of it is profoundly immoral. Now, I also mentioned, of course, that Kant was a deontologist. So if you look at a lot of the things that Kant talks about in his moral philosophy, he talks about a kind of system, if you will, of different types of duties. And these duties, broadly speaking, fall into two categories. You've got perfect duties and you've got imperfect duties. And no, imperfect duties are not like duties that are not that good. He's using imperfect here in a different sense, which I'll explain in a minute. But before we get into that, note that perfect duties are sometimes called duties of justice, also negative duties or narrow duties. Imperfect duties are sometimes called duties of beneficence or positive or wide duties. So I'll give you guys a minute, even though this, will be, a version of this will be videoed and so on. I'll give you guys just a minute to maybe jot that down or just mentally note that. Okay. So what are perfect duties? Well, perfect duties can never be violated. Actually, that's a bit of a mischaracterization. I should have said they should never be violated, because of course Kant would say you do have freedom of the will. So Kant knew, obviously, you could violate them. But can here is really a moral can. It's like you really ought not to. So there are, in other words, no exceptions to these kinds of duties. And this is, of course, why Kant is, to some extent, to a large extent, what is called a moral absolutist. There are no exceptions to moral rules. Now, this follows from the fact that these duties are identified by the fact, like we saw with these previous examples, they violate the categorical imperative. They don't pass that test. So logically, they're things that ought never to be done. But notice, they also are sometimes called negative duties because they tell us what not to do. They don't tell us really what we should do. If I tell you don't steal, you'd be like, okay, well, I wasn't planning to do that, but like, what should I do? Should I donate to charity? Should I, walk senior citizens across the street? Should I become a doctor, lawyer, whatever? It's like, geez, I don't know. That's a lot of questions, right? I just told you what to avoid. And that's what perfect duties do. So they're perfect in the sense that they're complete. Perfectum in Latin means done or complete, or, without anything left over to be accomplished. So for example, I have a universal duty. I have a perfect duty never to lie. So if a Nazi shows up at my door and I'm hiding Anne Frank, and the Nazi asks, "Are you hiding Jews in your attic?" I have to either be silent or I have to tell the truth, according to Kant. I can't lie. Since you can't universalize stealing, you must never steal. Murdering someone involves using them as a mere means, so that should never be done. Now, there is a subtle point here for Kant. You might think this would mean that we should never kill anybody. Kant doesn't actually go that far, because he does think there are legitimate cases, say in wartime, or, Kant also supported capital punishment for reasons I won't get into now. But suffice it to say, murder here is obviously defined as the deliberate killing of innocent human life, right? So there is a little more complexity to that point than might be obvious at first blush. Kant also said suicide cannot be universalized, right? So that he would say that if whenever people thought that their happiness was outweighed by suffering in life, or that their pain outweighed their pleasure, that they committed suicide. He said that if nature followed that kind of protocol, followed that maxim, nature itself would stop. But notice something that's curious about that kind of example. So Kant, in that second formulation, says humanity in your own person or in the persons of anybody else. So Kant thinks we have duties not just to other people, but we have duties to ourselves as well. So in this respect, Kant's theory is closer to a natural law theory than it is to any kind of consequentialist theory. So he does think that we can actually make choices that violate some sacrosanct duty to our own person. Okay, so then we have imperfect duties. So these are duties that they're not bad duties, they're just duties that are not fully specified. They have a wide latitude. These are duties that have to be performed some of the time, but they don't have to be performed all of the time. And indeed, I'll give you a couple of examples here. It's probably impossible to perform these all the time. There's a certain degree of judgment that we're going to have to use about when we actually perform these duties. So it's going to be largely up to us how and when we perform them. And they basically tell us what we ought to do in certain cases, right? They confer some benefit either on ourselves or on other people. So for example, take an idea like one should help other people, okay? Kant would say this is an imperfect duty. Now you might ask, why is that the case, right? Well, think about it. If you had a maxim that said that we should help other people, is that something that can be universally acted upon? Well, it certainly wouldn't violate the categorical imperative, right? Because, there's no contradiction in saying, yeah, help people. That sounds perfectly good. But notice, you'd probably have to decide whom to help, when to help, and how much to help them. For instance, should you become a school teacher and help people that way? Should you become a police officer? Should you become a loan officer at a bank? Should you be a medical researcher? Should you give money to charity X, Y, or Z, and so on? Now, you might say, okay, but wait a second, why not just be kind of stingy, right? Let's say that you said, I don't want to help anybody at all, right? Could you actually do that just across the board? What do you guys think about that? I mean, it's one thing to say that you should help people, and maybe if you accept that you should help people some of the time, maybe, just for practical reasons, you'd have to accept you can't help people all of the time. So maybe you help your grandmother, maybe you help your neighbor, but you don't help lots of other people. And there's really nothing wrong with that. But why not just say, no, Kant's wrong. I should probably, I've decided I'm never going to help anybody at all. Is that something that you think is feasible?
I guess the problem is, I don't know how exactly that would ever play out. 'Cause then how could people ever cooperate to form things like societies and things like that? 'Cause that's technically like helping each other.
Right. So, I mean, yeah, that's interesting, right? Because it seems as though all of us from time to time have to rely upon the help of other people. So it would be inconsistent of us to say we will never help other people at all. If you think about it, the very fact that we're alive right now indicates that, because we were biologically dependent upon other people from a very young age. It indicates that at some point, as rational agents, we couldn't function at all without having parents and other kinds of people. So in point of fact, you can't really consistently say you should never help other people, because at least in the past, you've had to rely upon other people. And clearly, at some point in the future, let's say you're in a car accident today and you're bleeding out on the side of the highway, right? There's let's say you have a rational self-interest as a rational agent. You could not continue to exist and to do other duties, to perform other kinds of duties in your life without being reliant upon other people like first responders, right? So Kant would say that's actually inconsistent, right? So you can imagine a world in which no one helped others, but that's not really a world in which a rational being would choose to live, right? You need to protect yourself. You need to learn valuable skills. You need to develop your talents. If you tried to maximize the maxim, never help other people, your own needs would actually ultimately never be met. They would be frustrated. So to be fully human, you have to expect that from time to time, you are going to be reliant upon other people. So you are somehow complicit in this idea that other people have to help other people. And so clearly it would be inconsistent for you not to help other people. But notice, even if we accept that, that still doesn't tell us whom to help and how much you should help, right? Now, another example that Kant gives is the idea of developing your own talents. So a talent might be something like, let's say you could have a talent to become a musician, or you have a talent to be a teacher. You have a talent to, I don't know, be a good parent, or be a medical researcher, or an astronaut, or whatever. Now, you might say, and in fact, I've known people like this. You know, people I went to high school with, for example, there's one person in particular. He's still kind of living in his parents' house, you know, still doing the same kinds of things that he did in high school. And I mean, this is, not to date myself, but this is a long time ago, right? And if you were to ask him, like, I don't know, like, I mean, do you want to get an education? Do you want to maybe get a different type of job? No, I've no desire. He just sort of sits on his couch and plays video games, right? And I guess he's happy. He's not developing his talents all that much. I mean, I don't know, maybe he's really good at Nintendo games or, you know, PlayStation or whatever, but that's not what Kant means, I think, by really developing your talents, right? But notice, you could attempt never to become a better person, but that would really contradict your needs as a rational being, right? I mean, for instance, right now, we're speaking a language. And it's certainly not the only language in the world, right? But it's a useful language in our case for instruction, right? Without us ever learning a language, without us ever developing that talent, we could not do philosophy. We could not read road signs. We could not function in a society with other people. We would find it difficult, if not impossible, to start and run a successful business or have a career. And so if you think about it, we may choose to develop different talents. But if we chose never to develop our talents at all, that would produce a kind of inconsistency or contradiction because we have other needs as rational agents. Now, I mentioned this idea of natural law before, and it's worth noting Kant's ethical theory has a certain notion of human nature that lies behind us. So Kant thinks that all of us have this innate predisposition to develop in a variety of ways. So this goes on sort of three different levels. So you might think of this, if you study developmental psychology, this will make sense. If not, it's just an example. It's not really all that relevant. But if you think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you know, you have the kind of base needs like food, water, shelter, and then you have kind of other needs like societal or rational, more intellectual or spiritual needs and so on. There's something like this. So like sort of at the bottom of the pyramid, so to speak, you might say, we've got these raw animalistic needs. We like food, maybe sex, you know, just for Kant, that would be more like the reproduction of the species. So it continues, shelter and so on, basic levels of protection. Then we have a predisposition to develop other kinds of human needs, right? So we have social needs, right? We're social creatures. So we want to be admired. We want to feel good about ourselves. We want a sense of belonging in a community together. But that makes us kind of like hive creatures. We're kind of similar in a way to bees and so on, right? So it's a cut above, the world of bees. It's more societally structured. We speak a language. We are interrelated in certain ways. But then beyond that, we have this disposition to develop our personality, to be fully autonomous beings that exist as members of a community. Another example you could think about here, also from psychology, Lawrence Kohlberg, that's Kohlberg, did studies with children, looking at how their sense of moral awareness developed over a number of years. And so he speculated that people start off and they're not really autonomous beings at all. Their view of morality is they just kind of do what members of their social group do. But eventually, hopefully, they reach a point where they're fully autonomous and they critique the norms of their society, and they make intelligible and intelligent decisions on their own. So Kant's view, I think, is very kind of similar. At least it's consistent with that kind of Maslowian or Kohlbergian sort of view, that human nature ought to be, striving to develop in more significant ways. Okay. Now, here's an example. I know you guys have probably seen this sort of example before. This is one version of a trolley problem called the Fat Man, right? So called because, as the example will illustrate, the idea would be, in order to stop this train or trolley, you need somebody of a certain size in order to stop it. So it says you're on a footbridge overlooking a railway track, and you see a train hurtling towards you, and 5 people are tied to the rails. Can they be saved? Again, the moral philosopher has arranged so that they can. There's an obese man leaning over the footbridge. If you were to push him, he would tumble over and squelch onto the track. He's so fat that his bulk would bring the train to a juddering halt. Sadly, the process would kill the fat man, but it would save the other 5 people. Should you shove him over? Now, the classic utilitarian analysis here is, yes, you should push the person over. In another variety, another version of this same kind of idea, you're not on a bridge, but you're on a sort of side spur, and you have the ability to throw a lever and divert the trolley onto a different track, and you get the same result. You're trading off the numbers here. Would you kill 1 person to save 5? If you're a utilitarian, you're going to say, all things being equal, the greater number is what should control the decision here. However, if you ask this kind of question, right, in terms of different moral theories, right, you get a different response. A utilitarian is going to say, yeah, you should push the person over the bridge. Yeah, you should throw the switch. Because all things being equal, the greater good is what really should predominate here. Now, I should say all things being equal means something like, if you had a situation in which, let's say the 1 person you were sacrificing was Albert Einstein, and the 5 people you were saving were, I don't know, maybe they were a terrorist cell. The utilitarian would have to give a different response there, just in terms of the different consequences that might result. Now, if you're a relativist, you're going to say the answer depends upon some relative standard. So if you're a subjectivist, you're going to say, well, what does the individual want to do? Yeah, I felt like throwing the switch. I felt like pushing the person over, or I didn't feel like doing it. There are no rules, right? It's all relative. Or a cultural relativist, or what's sometimes called a group relativist, will say, it depends on whatever my culture decides. So if you're in a culture that says, yeah, we have this rule that says, yeah, you should always sacrifice, one person to save five. Okay, it's right for that group, but it may not be right for all groups because it's relative. If you're a divine command theorist, you're going to say, this really depends on whether a divine being wants me to do this, right? So if a voice from the whirlwind says, hey, today's Tuesday or whatever, you have to push people over bridges, yours not to question why, right? That's what you got to do. Now, if you're a Kantian, I think the answer here is going to be no, you have an absolute duty not to kill, where killing here really means something like murdering an innocent person, right? So what I like about this kind of analysis is I think it makes it really crystal clear about what the difference is between Kant and these other kinds of theories, right? Because it's not just that he would make a different decision. It's also that the underlying analysis here, the motivation, the justification is actually quite different, as you can sort of see. Now, a similar kind of problem comes up. This also comes from Philippa Foot, who is the originator of the original trolley problem back in the, I guess, late 50s. This problem is 5 mortally ill patients are in care at a hospital, all of whom will soon die. At the same time, a 6th man is undergoing a routine checkup at the same hospital. A transplant surgeon in residence finds that the only medical means of saving the 5 ailing patients would be to slay the 6th person and transplant into those patients his healthy organs. Legal ramifications and peripheral matters disregarded, is it morally right to do so? So again, different problem here. You're dealing with transplants and patients. But the same kind of underlying logic applies here. You're balancing the needs of the many against the needs of the few, or in this case, the one person. And I think in this case, it's debatable whether or not a utilitarian would, automatically have to say, yeah, I mean, there's a rule that says, you shouldn't do this to patients. Because keep in mind, there may be rare cases in which, yeah, if this is really all that matters, you think, okay, the greater number really is what counts. But I don't think a Kantian could ever really accept that, right? Because it's not a consequentialist approach. Now that leads to some possible criticisms of the categorical imperative and Kant's ethics in general, and then I'll open this up for questions. So the first thing to note, and by the way, these are not the only problems you might register here, but these are the main ones. So one thing to note is it seems that the consequences actually do matter. If you're a Kantian, you're going to be stuck in some pretty difficult situations, hopefully on a rare basis, but it could happen. What do I mean by that? Well, first of all, you could have the Anne Frank kind of situation where, I mean, what do? Somebody asks you, are you hiding people in your attic? And the person who asks you this is an SS officer, or a member of the Gestapo. What do? You could, of course, rather than lie, you could be silent, or you could try to change the subject. You could say, wow, did you polish those boots yourself? And, it's like, hey, do you want some strudel? And all of these other kinds of things. But that's just going to be, that's too obvious. At some point, your life is probably on the line. They're going to be pistol whipping you and asking you these questions. So, for all practical purposes, right, you might decide to lie. But if you lie, if you think lying is right in that case, then Kant can't be correct because Kant says lying is always wrong. Now, there's also another problem that is associated with this, and that's the problem of moral luck. Have you guys ever heard of moral luck before?
No, I can't say I have.
It's an expression that is used. I don't know if he coined the term, but Thomas Nagel talks about this a little bit. He's got an article called Moral Luck. Moral luck refers to situations in which the morality of an action or the moral responsibility attributed to an agent in a situation seems to be dependent on things that are outside of the control, i.e., it's luck or just fortune, outside of the control of the agent. So an example that's sometimes given is the following. Imagine a person goes off to a party and they get really, really drunk. And they do a really stupid thing. They decide to drive home. And they manage to get home okay. They don't run over anybody. They don't damage property. They make it home by like the grace of God, right? They wake up the next morning with a horrible hangover. But of course, they're technically guilty of drinking and driving, but they weren't caught. They didn't run over anybody. So somebody might say, okay, don't do that again, but no harm, no foul. Nothing bad actually happened. Stupid thing. Now imagine another person. They also go off. They get just as drunk at the same party. They get in a car. They drive home. Same intention, same maxim as the first guy I described. But unfortunately, they run over somebody and they kill the person. We don't evaluate these two cases the same way. One person is guilty of motor vehicle homicide and drinking and driving. They may do jail time for that. They may be financially ruined because of that, for perfectly legitimate reasons. Because again, they're guilty of motor vehicle homicide and drinking and driving. However, from the point of view of the agent, from the point of view of the maxim, if the first person, let's call him Dave, got home free without harming anybody, and the second person, Dan, did not, why do we evaluate Dan and Dave differently? The reason, I think, is that we do think that morality has more to do with the consequences than what Kant actually allows for, that the consequences do matter here. So in that point, or in that respect, it may be the case that Kant is wrong there. So that's something to think about. Two more considerations here would be point number 2. If Kant is right, the only thing that matters, morally speaking, the only thing that has moral standing or rights will be rational agents. Now, he doesn't precisely define this, but I think for a rational agent would have to be conscious, would have to be able to have some ability to be autonomous, and therefore would have to be able to weigh maxims and make choices. So I think you and I would count as rational agents. I think maybe an angel, if angels exist, would count as a rational agent. I think Mr. Spock, being half Vulcan and being half human, would count as a rational agent. Maybe Marvin the Martian from the Looney Tunes cartoons. He seems to have purposes. He seems to weigh options and so on. I don't know if a fetus would count. I don't know if comatose or a person in a persistent vegetative state would count. I'm pretty sure that animals would not count. So a dog or a cat, I don't think would count as a moral agent for Kant. A crustacean certainly would not count. I mean, there doesn't seem to be much going on there. So a lot of people that think animals have some kind of rights or that they have some moral dimension to them, at least that their needs ought to be weighed in a moral universe. A lot of those theorists will say Kant's ethics is at the very least incomplete. Now, if you look this up, I think Tom Regan, R-E-G-A-N, applies a kind of Kantian perspective and tries to say that you could use Kant to motivate some more robust notion of animal rights, but he's very much an exception. So that's also something to think about. Put another way, you could say, if you think animals have rights, that's a challenge for you if you're a Kantian. So I can't say they can't go together, but there's more work to be done there. So it is a consideration. Last point is Kant says conflicts of duty don't really exist, that at any given time, there's one duty that you ought to perform. and it doesn't conflict with other kinds of duties that you might have. However, it seems like in many cases that's not the case. So for example, it could be the case that on the grounds that you can't universalize torture or that it violates a person's humanity, you might say torture is wrong. And so at the same time, you could say, well, maybe protecting innocent life is also something we should do. And yet, what if somebody thought that torture was the only way of getting intel that would protect innocent life in a particular case? Then it seems to me you have to make a choice. You can't actually do both duties. You can't honor both values at the same time, right? We have torture and we have protecting innocent life. So it seems like a conflict of duty could exist. Now, the last point, a little clarification here. Some Kantians, Roger Sullivan would be an example of this. Sullivan wrote actually a really good book on Kant's moral theory, which I would highly recommend. And that came out maybe 20, 30 years ago, but it should still be in print. Sullivan and some other people point out that this example that I have about torture and protecting innocent life doesn't really sink Kant. Because what happens here is if we accept that torture is a case of a perfect duty. So if you have a perfect duty, like you should never treat a person as a mere means. What we have here is you have a perfect duty not to torture, but you have an imperfect duty to protect innocent people. So the conflict here is not between two perfect duties, but rather it's a conflict between a perfect duty and an imperfect duty. So what Sullivan and some other people have suggested is that what Kant would say is you can never have a situation in which two perfect duties are equally balanced against each other, where you would have a logical conflict. But you may have situations like this where you have a perfect duty and it seems to violate an imperfect duty. And in that case, the perfect duty, torturing, takes precedence over protecting innocent life. In other words, because protecting innocent life is an imperfect duty, it has less weight than a perfect duty. So the conflict is only apparent, it's not full-blown, so to speak. So that is a way that you could try to get around that sort of problem.